Humanity did not discover the wider universe by listening for it. The listening had been done for centuries and yielded nothing but the slow, cosmic breathing of stars and the mathematical chatter of radiation. Humanity discovered the wider universe by breaking itself open and stepping through the wound. The first rupture engine tore a hole in spacetime large enough for a ship and small enough for the people inside it to survive. And when the vessel emerged on the other side, it was not greeted by a choir of civilizations or a wall of hostile fire, but by something far more unsettling: indifference. The stars were still there, arranged differently, colder in some places, crowded in others, and the silence was not a metaphorical one. It was the practical silence of a universe that had not been waiting. The exploration vessel Far Horizon carried a crew chosen less for their brilliance than for their stubbornness. They were engineers who refused to accept that something could not be fixed, navigators who trusted intuition as much as equations, and soldiers who had learned restraint as a discipline rather than a lack of aggression. Among them was Maribel Kwan, whose official role was structural systems analyst, but who had been selected because she had once held together a collapsing orbital refinery with nothing but improvised clamps and a refusal to let go. She stood now in the observation blister, watching a star with a spectrum she had never seen before, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever the universe reminded her that it did not care who she was. The Far Horizon had been traveling beyond mapped space for 3 weeks when it encountered its first evidence of non-human technology. There was no grand reveal, no fleet decloaking in synchronized menace. Instead, the sensors picked up a pattern of gravitational anomalies orbiting a gas giant with bands the color of old copper. At first, the anomalies were assumed to be natural, perhaps the remains of a shattered moon or an unusual resonance. It took hours of cross-checking before the conclusion became unavoidable. The objects were artificial, arranged with intent, and older than anything humanity had ever built. Captain Iosif Calderon convened the senior crew in the briefing chamber, a room designed to feel larger than it was by curving the walls outward and bathing them in a soft, indirect light. He was a tall man whose posture suggested a lifetime of bracing himself against unseen pressure, and when he spoke, it was with the calm precision of someone who understood that panic was contagious. He laid out the data without embellishment and then did something that unsettled Maribel more than the discovery itself. He smiled. "This," he said, tapping the display where the anomalies danced like patient ghosts, "is proof that we are not alone and that whoever came before us did not feel the need to leave a sign saying so." The decision to approach was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Humanity had not crossed a wound in spacetime to turn away from its first glimpse of alien engineering. The Far Horizon adjusted course, and as it drew closer, the shapes resolved into massive ringed structures, each 1 kilometers across, woven from materials that bent sensor readings into polite lies. They were not weapons platforms or habitats in any recognizable sense. They were anchors, stabilizing the gas giant's turbulent gravity in a way that suggested a purpose no one could yet articulate. The first contact did not come from the rings. It came from the darkness between them. The ship's proximity alarms sang, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through conversation and sent hands flying to stations. Something had emerged from a fold in space, so shallow it barely registered as a violation of physics, and it was moving with an economy of motion that suggested confidence rather than haste. The vessel was asymmetrical, its silhouette a study in deliberate imbalance, with protrusions that might have been weapons or might have been sensory arrays. Its surface absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and it radiated a gravitational signature that made Maribel's teeth ache. Communications attempts were made immediately, broadcasting on every frequency and modulation humanity knew how to generate, wrapped in mathematical primers and symbolic representations of intent. The alien ship did not respond, but it did not fire either. It matched the far horizon's velocity and settled into a parallel orbit around the gas giant, close enough that its presence distorted the stars behind it. Hours passed in a tense equilibrium. The crew rotated shifts, but few slept. Marable remained at her station, monitoring the stress tolerances of the hull as the alien gravity played gentle havoc with the ship's frame. She found herself thinking about the people who had built the rings, about what kind of minds saw a gas giant and decided to tame it with architecture. When the alien ship finally spoke, it did so not with sound or radio waves, but by altering the local curvature of space in a pattern that the far horizon's instruments translated into data. The translation was imperfect, but the meaning was clear enough to raise the hair on Marable's arms. You are trespassing in a stabilized system. State your origin and purpose. Captain Calderon answered without hesitation, identifying humanity, the Sol system, and the exploratory nature of their mission. He chose his words carefully, framing their presence as curiosity rather than claim. The reply came after a pause that might have been deliberation or might have been the time it took for an alien mind to decide how much effort humans were worth. Your species is newly arrived, the message said. Your technology is crude but inventive. This system is under custodianship. Departure is advised. The word custodianship sparked a flurry of whispered debate among the linguists, but before they could refine a response, the alien ship added something unexpected. If you remain, you will be observed. Observation was not a threat, not overtly, but it carried weight. Captain Calderon accepted the condition, reasoning that being watched was preferable to being expelled into the unknown without answers. The far horizon maintained its orbit, and the days that followed were a study in mutual restraint. The alien vessel remained nearby, silent but attentive, while the human crew conducted scans and measurements, careful to avoid anything that could be construed as interference with the rings. It was on the fifth day that the universe reminded them that first contact stories were never just about two parties. A distortion rippled through space at the edge of the system, violent and unmistakable, and out of it came ships that made the alien custodian vessel look almost delicate by comparison. These newcomers were built for war, their forms optimized for offense, their energy signatures aggressive and unashamed. They did not announce themselves, they attacked. The far horizon was not a warship, but it had teeth, and it bared them. Defensive systems flared, point defenses spitting controlled fury, as the crew moved with the precision of people who had trained for disasters they hoped would never come. The alien custodian vessel reacted instantly, interposing itself between the attackers and the rings, unleashing weapons that bent space itself into lethal shapes. The battle was brief and brutal, a clash of technologies that made human senses struggle to keep up. Marable felt the impact before she heard it, a deep shudder that ran through the far horizon as a stray shot grazed the hull. Alarms howled, and she was already moving, hands flying over controls as she rerouted power and shored up weakened supports. Through the chaos, she became aware of something else, a subtle shift in the alien vessel's behavior. It was no longer merely defending the system. It was coordinating with the human ship, anticipating its movements, covering its blind spots. When the attackers were destroyed or driven off, the system fell into an uneasy quiet. The rings remained intact, the gas giant continued its slow, majestic spin, and the alien custodian vessel held position, its gravitational signature pulsing with what might have been the equivalent of heavy breathing. Captain Calderon opened a channel, offering assistance, supplies, anything that might be needed. The response took longer this time. The entities you encountered are not uncommon, the message finally said. They exploit systems stabilized by others, stripping resources and leaving collapse in their wake. Your intervention was statistically unnecessary but tactically effective. It was an oddly backhanded acknowledgement, but it was acknowledgement nonetheless. The conversation that followed was halting, built on imperfect translations and cautious revelations. The custodians, whose self-designation was a concept closer to stewards than owners, were an ancient coalition of species bound by a shared philosophy rather than a central authority. They did not expand, they maintained. When a system reached a certain threshold of complexity, they stepped in to prevent catastrophic instabilities, whether those were gravitational, ecological, or socio-political. Humanity, it seemed, had stumbled into a universe with rules it did not know and roles it had not been assigned. The most startling moment came when the custodian vessel requested permission to board the far horizon. The crew froze, every instinct screaming danger, but Captain Cauldron agreed after securing strict parameters. The boarding party consisted of a single entity, accompanied by a field that maintained its environmental needs. It was tall and sinuous, its form a study in flexible geometry, with limbs that divided and rejoined as it moved. Its surface was translucent, revealing a slow, luminous circulation within. Marable watched from across the bay as it examined the ship with what could only be described as curiosity. When it spoke, the translation came through the ship systems, its tone neutral but not cold. Your construction methods prioritize redundancy and adaptability, it said. This is inefficient by our standards. We call it survival, Captain Cauldron replied. The alien paused, its internal light pulsing. Survival is an inefficient goal. Continuity is preferable. That Marable realized was the heart of the difference. Humanity survived by bending, by breaking and reforging itself in the face of disaster. The custodians maintained continuity by preventing disaster in the first place, smoothing the universe into something predictable. Neither approach was inherently superior, but the tension between them was palpable. As the alien departed, leaving behind a data exchange far richer than anyone had dared hope for, Marable felt the weight of what had begun to settle on her shoulders. Humanity had been observed, evaluated, and found wanting in some ways and promising in others. They had been allowed to remain not out of kindness, but out of interest. The far horizon stayed in the system for another week, learning what it could and sharing what it was permitted. When it finally prepared to depart, Captain Cauldron addressed the crew with a gravity that matched the stars outside. "We have learned something important," he said. "The universe is not waiting for us, but it is watching. What we do next will matter." As the rupture engine charged, Marable took one last look at the rings around the gas giant and the alien custodian vessel that hovered nearby, a silent sentinel. She wondered what humanity would become under observation, and whether the universe would be ready for a species that survived not by maintaining continuity, but by rewriting it. The return to human-mapped space did not bring relief. It brought delay. The far horizon emerged from rupture travel into a region dense, with traffic and automated beacons, and yet the familiar noise of humanity felt strangely muted, as if the crew had returned with ears tuned to a broader spectrum and now found the old frequencies lacking. Reports were transmitted, compressed and encrypted, routed through channels that would eventually spill into committees and councils and analysts who would argue about implications, while the people who had seen the alien rings tried to sleep. Official instructions were simple: hold position, await debriefing, do not disseminate details beyond approved channels. Unofficially, the crew understood that they had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Marable Quan found that the rhythms of routine no longer fit her the way they once had. She ran diagnostics, oversaw repairs from the skirmish, and filed meticulous reports on structural stresses induced by alien gravity, but her mind kept drifting back to the custodian entity and its luminous, deliberate movements. Continuity over survival. The phrase gnawed at her. Humanity had survived plagues, wars, and near extinctions precisely because it did not prize continuity above all else. It adapted, often messily, sometimes brutally. To be judged by a standard that valued stability over resilience felt like being measured with the wrong tool. The debriefing station was a rotating habitat built into the shadow of a small moon, its architecture utilitarian and reassuringly ugly. The far horizon docked, and the crew disembarked into corridors that smelled faintly of recycled air and disinfectant. They were separated, ushered into individual rooms where analysts waited behind translucent screens. Questions came in waves, probing not just what had happened, but how it had felt. The custodians' words were dissected, their actions mapped onto predictive models. When Marable described the rings and their purpose, she saw interest sharpen into something like hunger. "You are certain they were stabilizing the gas giant's gravity?" one analyst asked, her voice calm, her eyes too attentive. "As certain as our instruments allowed," Marable replied. "They weren't extracting resources, they were preventing collapse." "And you believe they do this for multiple systems?" "They implied it was their role," Marable said. "Not conquest, maintenance." The analyst leaned back, fingers steepled. "Maintenance implies authority, or responsibility," Marable countered before she could stop herself. The analyst's lips twitched. "Those are often the same thing." Between interviews, the crew gathered in the station's communal spaces, speaking in low voices, sharing impressions that had not made it into official logs. Captain Calderon moved among them, listening more than speaking. He understood that whatever decisions came next would not be made by the people who had risked their lives, but he also knew that morale mattered. The Far Horizon's crew had seen humanity reflected in alien eyes, and that reflection would shape them whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The waiting stretched into days, then weeks. News trickled in from other exploratory vessels, fragments of encounters that suggested the Far Horizon's experience was not unique. Humanity was not alone, and it was not the first to arrive late. There were whispers of other powers, less restrained than the custodians, whose interactions with younger species were transactional at best and predatory at worst. The attackers in the stabilized system had been identified as part of a loose coalition driven by resource scarcity and opportunism, their tactics effective against those who lacked protection. When orders finally came, they were not what anyone had expected. The Far Horizon was to be recommissioned immediately, its mission parameters expanded rather than curtailed. Humanity, it seemed, had decided that observation was insufficient. If there were beings who claimed custodianship over complex systems and others who sought to exploit them, then humanity needed to understand where it fit in that dynamic. The Far Horizon would serve as an emissary, returning to the stabilized system with a formal proposal. The proposal was simple in concept and radical in implication. Humanity would offer assistance in maintaining system stability, not as subordinates or clients, but as collaborators. They would share technologies developed for resilience under uncertainty, for rapid response to cascading failures. In exchange, they would seek access to custodian knowledge, not ownership, but understanding. It was a gamble born of a species that had learned to stake its future on unlikely alliances. Marable read the briefing materials with a mixture of pride and dread. She had been named as part of the technical delegation, tasked with explaining human approaches to structural adaptability. The irony was not lost on her. She would be arguing for the value of inefficiency to beings who had mastered optimization on a cosmic scale. The return journey felt different. The crew knew what awaited them, and the unknown had edges now, a shape defined by experience. As the Far Horizon slipped back through the wound in space-time and re-entered the stabilized system, the rings greeted them with their silent patience. The custodian vessel emerged from its quiet vigil, matching course with a familiarity that suggested it had been tracking their approach long before human sensors could detect it. Communication was established more quickly this time. The custodian entity acknowledged their return, and inquired about their intentions with a directness that bordered on brusque. Captain Calderon transmitted the proposal, its language carefully balanced between humility and assertion. There was a long pause, during which the alien vessel remained motionless, its internal light dimmed. "Your species exhibits persistence," the response finally came. "You seek to integrate without full comprehension of the systems involved. This introduces risk." "We live with risk," Calderon replied. "We manage it by preparing for failure rather than pretending it won't happen." The custodian entity considered this. "Failure is inefficient. So is extinction," Calderon said. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything humanity had experienced. It was not a matter of treaties or borders, but of philosophy. The custodians explained their origins in fragments, a history of civilizations that had risen and fallen, leaving behind scars in the fabric of space. Their coalition had formed not out of altruism, but out of necessity. Unchecked complexity led to collapse, and collapse on a stellar scale threatened everything nearby. By intervening early, by smoothing instabilities, they preserved continuity. Humanity's counterpoint was born of scars of a different kind. Marable spoke when called upon, describing how human structures were designed to fail gracefully, how redundancy and modularity allowed systems to absorb shocks and reconfigure. She spoke of cities rebuilt after disasters, of technologies repurposed under pressure, of a species that had learned to thrive not by preventing all collapse, but by ensuring collapse was not final. The custodian entity listened, its luminous circulation quickening. "Your approach tolerates repeated disruption," it observed. "This suggests an acceptance of loss." "We don't accept loss," Marable said, surprised at her own intensity. "We expect it, and we plan to keep going anyway." There was a subtle shift then, a change in the way the alien vessel positioned itself relative to the rings and the far horizon. The custodians agreed to a limited trial. Humanity would be allowed to assist in the maintenance of a secondary system, one less critical than the gas giant's stabilization, under close observation. Success would lead to deeper collaboration. Failure would result in expulsion. The secondary system was a binary star arrangement with a debris field left over from a long-destroyed planet. The custodians had installed a network of stabilizers to prevent the debris from coalescing into something dangerous, but the system was prone to unpredictable resonances. It was, in custodian terms, inefficient to maintain. In human terms, it was a challenge tailor-made for their approach. Marable threw herself into the work. Human engineers deployed adaptive frameworks, flexible lattices designed to shift in response to changing forces. They introduced controlled points of failure, areas where stress could be released without propagating catastrophe. The custodians watched, skeptical but attentive, their own constructs interfacing with human designs in cautious increments. The first major test came sooner than expected. A surge in stellar activity sent waves through the debris field, overwhelming one of the custodian stabilizers. Alarms flared, not just on human consoles, but within the alien vessel itself. The custodians moved to compensate, reinforcing the failing node, but the surge was too chaotic. Continuity was threatened. "Let it go," Marable urged over the shared channel. "Redirect flow. We'll catch the fallout." The custodian entity hesitated for a fraction of a second that felt monumental. Then it complied, allowing the stabilizer to fail. Human systems responded, absorbing fragments, rerouting forces, sacrificing components to preserve the whole. The debris field shifted, violent but contained, and when the surge passed, the system settled into a new equilibrium. The aftermath was quiet, charged with unspoken recalibration. The custodian entity addressed the human crew, its tone altered in a way the translators struggled to categorize. "Your methods preserved overall stability through localized loss," it said. "This outcome was within acceptable parameters, though it deviates from optimal continuity." "Welcome to our comfort zone," Captain Calderon replied. Trust did not blossom overnight. The custodians were cautious, methodical, their observation relentless, but data accumulated, undeniable in its implications. Human adaptability complemented custodian precision. Where the custodians excelled at prevention, humans excelled at response. Together, they achieved efficiencies neither could alone. News of the collaboration spread, not just among humans, but across the web of civilizations that skirted custodian-influenced space. Some saw opportunity, others saw threat. The opportunistic coalition that had attacked the stabilized system took note, their interest sharpening as reports filtered through black markets and intercepted transmissions. A new variable had entered the equation, one that upset established patterns. Marable became aware of this shifting attention through a subtle change in the custodian entity's behavior. It consulted with the human crew more frequently, sharing broader strategic concerns. The opportunists were mobilizing, testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses. The stabilized systems were no longer just sites of maintenance. They were symbols. Humanity found itself in an unfamiliar position. It was no longer merely exploring. It was participating in a balance of power it barely understood. The temptation to retreat, to pull back and observe from a safe distance, was strong. But the trial had revealed something else, something that resonated deeply with Marable and others like her. The universe was complex and fragile, and humanity's talent for surviving chaos might be more than a quirk. It might be needed. The next crisis confirmed it. A coordinated incursion struck multiple peripheral systems simultaneously, overwhelming custodian resources. The opportunists had adapted, targeting points of inefficiency, exploiting the custodians' reluctance to allow controlled failure. The Far Horizon and other human vessels were called in, their adaptive systems deployed across a widening front. Marable worked until exhaustion blurred the edges of her vision, coordinating rapid repairs, improvising solutions as situations evolved. She watched as custodian constructs learned, slowly at first, then faster, incorporating elements of human design. She also saw humans learn restraint, recognizing when prevention was preferable to response. The collaboration was not without friction, but it was effective. When the incursions were repelled, the cost was not negligible. Systems were altered, some irreversibly. But collapse had been avoided, and continuity preserved in a broader sense. The custodians convened a council, inviting human representatives to observe. It was there, amid discussions that spanned light years and lifespans measured in millennia, that a quiet realization took hold. Humanity was not being evaluated solely as a junior partner or a potential threat. It was being considered as a catalyst. A species whose comfort with disruption could, if guided, enhance the custodians' mission. A species that might help them address inefficiencies they had long accepted as unavoidable. For Marable, the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Humanity's flaws, its messy resilience, were being recognized as strengths, but recognition came with responsibility. If humans were to help shape continuity on a cosmic scale, they would have to confront the consequences of their interventions, the lives altered by decisions made far from home. As the Far Horizon prepared for its next assignment, deeper into custodian space, Marable stood once more at an observation blister, watching the binary stars of the secondary system trace their intricate dance. She thought of the phrase that had started it all, of survival versus continuity. Perhaps the distinction was not as stark as it had seemed. Perhaps continuity was not about preserving an unchanging state, but about ensuring that change did not become annihilation. The universe was watching still, but now it was not just observing. It was adjusting, making room for a species that survived by embracing the unfamiliar and finding, within it, a reason to keep going. The first human casualty of the collaboration did not come from battle, and that unsettled everyone more than a clean loss in combat would have. It came from misalignment, from a place where human assumptions slid past custodian certainties without ever quite touching. The engineer's name was Ria Monteverde, a specialist in adaptive field harmonics, and she died when a custodian lattice recalibrated itself mid-operation, collapsing a pocket of warped space. She was still inside. The custodians categorized the event as an unfortunate synchronization error. The humans called it a preventable death. Both were correct, and the difference between those truths carved a fault line through the partnership. Marable stood in the far horizon's medbay as the body was prepared for return, watching the careful motions of hands that had done this too many times before. There was no ceremony beyond quiet respect, no grand speech. Ria had known the risks, had volunteered eagerly, fascinated by the chance to work with physics that bent under thought rather than force. That knowledge did not soften the blow, it sharpened it. Humanity was used to loss, but it was not used to loss that came from being misunderstood rather than overmatched. The custodian entity assigned to liaise with the human fleet requested a private discussion. It chose a neutral space, a region of low stellar interference where ships could hold position without constant correction. The far horizon drifted there, its hull catching distant light, while the custodian vessel unfolded portions of itself into configurations Marable had learned to recognize as communicative rather than defensive. Your crew member's termination has been logged, the custodian entity began, its tone precise. Causality analysis indicates shared responsibility. That's one way to put it, Captain Cauldron replied, his voice controlled but tight. From our perspective, your system adjusted without accounting for a human presence you knew was there. Your presence was within acceptable operational parameters, the custodian said. The recalibration was necessary to prevent a cascading instability. And you didn't warn us, Cauldron said. We could have pulled her out. Warning would have delayed recalibration beyond safe margins. Marable felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was the crux of it, the place where philosophies collided. You optimized for the system, she said quietly, not for the people in it. The custodian entity's internal light shifted, patterns overlapping in a way that suggested computation layered with something else, perhaps uncertainty. Our mandate prioritizes systemic continuity. Individual loss is regrettable but statistically tolerable. That's not tolerable to us, Cauldron said, not when it's avoidable. The discussion stretched on, looping through definitions and priorities, neither side willing to yield ground that felt foundational. Eventually, a compromise emerged, not out of agreement but necessity. Joint operations would include mandatory human override windows, brief pauses during which recalibrations could be delayed to extract personnel. The custodians warned that this would introduce inefficiencies and increased risk. The humans accepted that. Risk, after all, was familiar territory. The adjustment had ripple effects beyond procedure. Trust, which had been growing cautiously, was bruised. Human crews became more guarded, less willing to embed deeply within custodian constructs. Custodian observers noted increased hesitation and recalculated projections of collaboration efficacy. The universe, indifferent as ever, did not pause to let them sort out their feelings. Pressure continued to build along the periphery. Reports came in of systems beyond custodian reach, experiencing sudden collapses. Not opportunistic raids, but failures that suggested sabotage layered atop natural instability. Someone was learning not just how to exploit stabilized systems, but how to push them into catastrophic failure without ever setting foot inside them. The opportunistic coalition denied involvement with transparent disinterest. The pattern did not match their usual behavior. This was something new. Analysis teams pored over data, human and custodian minds working in parallel, sometimes intersecting, sometimes diverging. Marable found herself increasingly involved, her understanding of adaptive failure modes providing insights into how a system might be nudged toward collapse, with minimal intervention. It was unsettling work, mapping out vulnerabilities not to exploit them, but to guard against them. Every solution revealed another weakness, another angle of attack. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A custodian archivist, an entity whose primary function was the preservation of historical data, shared records of a long-dormant species that had once occupied a role similar to humanity's current position. They had been collaborators, innovators, tolerated disruptors in an otherwise ordered cosmos. Over time, their methods had been absorbed, their distinctiveness smoothed out, until they were no longer a separate presence. Eventually, they ceased to exist as a recognizable civilization, their descendants folded into the custodian whole. This was presented not as a warning, but as context. Assimilation was, from the custodian perspective, a successful outcome. Continuity had been preserved. From the human perspective, it was erasure. Marable read the archival summaries late into what passed for night aboard the far horizon. The ship's lights dimmed to a simulated dusk. She imagined a future where humanity's sharp edges were blunted, its adaptability standardized, its inefficiencies engineered away. It was a future without extinction, perhaps, but also without the unpredictable sparks that had driven human creativity and resilience. The thought left her restless. She was not alone. Conversations among the crew shifted, gaining an undercurrent of quiet defiance. Humanity had entered this partnership willingly, but not blindly. They began to push back, subtly at first, insisting on preserving human methodologies even when custodian alternatives promised greater efficiency. They framed these choices as experimental variants, as data points worth preserving. The custodians allowed it, watching closely. The unknown saboteur struck again, this time closer to the heart of custodian space. A stabilized system hosting a dense cluster of habitats experienced a rapid destabilization that bypassed multiple safeguards. Human ships were among the first responders, their crews diving into chaos with practiced urgency. Marable coordinated from the far horizon, her voice hoarse as she directed teams, human and custodian alike, to contain the failure. They succeeded barely. Lives were saved, habitats preserved, but the damage was extensive. In the aftermath, traces were found, subtle signatures that pointed not to an external attack, but to manipulation of custodian protocols themselves. Someone understood custodian systems intimately, someone who had once been inside. The implication rippled through every level of collaboration. The archived species, long assimilated, had not vanished entirely. Fragments of their culture, their descent, had persisted, hidden within custodian networks. They had grown resentful, viewing the custodians not as preservers, but as jailers of potential. Their sabotage was not about resource extraction or conquest, it was ideological. They sought to prove that enforced continuity was a lie, that collapse was inevitable and should be allowed to happen. Humanity, once again, found itself between forces. On one side, the custodians, whose fear of collapse drove them to control and smooth. On the other, the dissidents, whose embrace of collapse bordered on nihilism. Neither extreme aligned with human experience. Humanity had lived through collapse and learned to rebuild. It neither worshipped continuity nor glorified destruction. The custodians convened another council, this one urgent and fraught. Human representatives were not just observers now. They were participants, their input actively solicited. The dissidents, embedded deep within custodian infrastructure, posed a threat that could not be neutralized by traditional means without risking widespread failure. The custodians' instinct was to isolate and excise, a surgical removal of corrupted nodes. Human analysts warned that such an approach could trigger the very cascades the dissidents sought. Marable spoke up during one session, her words carefully chosen. "You're treating this like a system error," she said. "It's not. It's a social fracture. You can't patch that with force alone." The custodian entity regarded her, its light patterns slow and contemplative. Your species has experience with internal descent, it said. Outcomes are often suboptimal. They are, Marable agreed. But sometimes, engaging with dissent changes the system in ways that make it stronger. Engagement implied dialogue, negotiation with entities that had already demonstrated a willingness to risk countless lives. It was a hard sell, but the alternative was grim. After extensive debate, a hybrid approach was adopted. Human-led teams would attempt contact, leveraging humanity's tolerance for ideological conflict. Custodian forces would stand ready, containment measures in place. Marable volunteered, driven by a sense that this was the logical extension of the role humanity had stumbled into. If humans were catalysts, then this was the reaction point. The contact was made through layered communication channels, probing for responses that deviated from custodian norms. When the dissidents replied, their language was sharp, their grievances laid bare. They spoke of stifled innovation, of worlds frozen in optimal but lifeless states, of a universe curated into predictability. "You think collapse makes things better," Marable said during one exchange. "We know it doesn't, but pretending it won't happen doesn't help either." The dissidents were intrigued, wary. Humanity was an anomaly, neither enforcer nor destroyer. Over time, a tenuous dialogue formed. The dissidents revealed that their sabotage was escalating, that they intended to force a reckoning that would shatter custodian dominance or die trying. Humanity offered an alternative, a space for dissent that did not require annihilation. Adaptive zones, systems where change was allowed, even encouraged, within boundaries designed to prevent total collapse. The idea was radical, inefficient, and terrifying to the custodians. It was also the kind of compromise humanity excelled at crafting. After long deliberation, and with the evidence of mounting sabotage hard to ignore, the custodians agreed to a limited experiment. The first adaptive zone was established at the edge of custodian space, a system deemed expendable by strict continuity metrics. Human and custodian technologies intertwined, creating a framework that allowed for rapid change while monitoring for runaway failure. Dissident entities were invited to participate, not as subjects, but as contributors. The universe held its breath, metaphorically speaking. The adaptive zone churned with activity, ideas colliding, systems evolving in unpredictable ways. There were failures, some spectacular, but the safeguards held. New forms of stability emerged, dynamic rather than static. The dissidents, confronted with a space where their need for change was acknowledged, began to redirect their efforts from sabotage to creation. It was not a perfect solution, nothing ever was, but it was a start, one that reframed the conflict not as continuity versus collapse, but as a spectrum of possibilities. Humanity's role as mediator, as translator between extremes, became clearer. For Marable, the experience was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. She saw the toll it took on everyone involved, the strain of constant adaptation, the weight of responsibility. She also saw glimpses of a future where the universe was not smoothed into uniformity nor left to tear itself apart, but allowed to breathe, to change, to recover. As the far horizon prepared to leave the adaptive zone for its next assignment, Marable reflected on how far they had come from that first indifferent star. Humanity was no longer just being observed. It was being tested, not for efficiency or dominance, but for its ability to hold contradictions without breaking. The gravity of unfamiliar mercy pulled at them still, not as a force that constrained, but as one that demanded balance. And humanity, messy and resilient, was learning how to lean into it without losing itself. The adaptive zone did not explode, implode, or dissolve into entropy, and that alone unsettled nearly every predictive model the custodians possessed. It persisted. It changed daily, sometimes hourly, its configurations shifting in response to internal pressures and external stimuli, but it did not collapse into unmanageable chaos. For the custodians, This was deeply uncomfortable. For humanity, it was familiar in the way a scar was familiar, not pleasant, but known. What no one had predicted was how quickly attention would converge on the experiment. Signals leaked, despite custodian efforts to compartmentalize. Curiosity spread along trade routes and data shadows. Species that had lived for cycles under custodian stabilization, chafing quietly or not at all, began to ask questions. Others, long excluded from custodian influence because their systems were deemed too volatile, saw opportunity. Even the opportunistic coalition, ever alert to imbalance, shifted posture, not toward immediate exploitation, but toward observation. The universe was recalculating. Maribel Kwan was promoted without ceremony. Her role expanded from structural systems analyst to interspecies integration architect, a title so broad it bordered on meaningless. In practice, it meant she spent her days embedded in contradiction. 1 hour she mediated between a custodian construct that wanted to lock an evolving habitat into a stable configuration and a dissident collective that insisted on letting it fracture and reassemble. The next, she advised human crews on how not to mistake custodian restraint for passivity or dissident fervor for recklessness. Sleep became irregular, time blurred. The adaptive zone demanded constant attention, and Maribel gave it, driven by a sense that if she stepped away, the delicate balance might tip. She was not alone. Across the human fleet, similar patterns emerged. People burned out, rotated out, were replaced. Humanity had always paid for progress with exhaustion. The custodians watched this too. Your species exhibits unsustainable operational tempo, the liaison entity observed during one of their scheduled reviews. Cognitive degradation indicators are increasing. We call it overextension, Maribel replied, rubbing her eyes. We've survived worse. Survival is not the metric in question. Then what is? She asked. The custodian's light patterns slowed. Longevity of contribution. The words lingered. Humanity had always assumed it would be the fragile party in this partnership, the one that needed protection or limitation. The idea that the custodians might be concerned about humans burning themselves out was unexpected and in its own way unsettling. Before the thought could fully settle, crisis arrived. It did not announce itself with violence. It crept in on quiet data streams, subtle discrepancies that only became obvious in aggregate. Systems far from the adaptive zone, long stabilized and considered low risk, began to show correlated fluctuations. Not failures, not sabotage signatures, but drift. Tiny deviations in gravitational anchoring, energy flow, ecological balance. Individually negligible, collectively alarming. The custodians traced the source inward, layer by layer, until the conclusion emerged with uncomfortable clarity. The adaptive zone was not isolated. Its dynamism was propagating through custodian networks, introducing variability into systems that had been optimized for static equilibrium. The universe, once smoothed, was beginning to ripple. The custodians convened an emergency council. This time the tone was not measured curiosity or philosophical debate. It was urgency. The adaptive zone is exerting destabilizing influence beyond projected boundaries, the presiding custodian entity stated. Continuation at current parameters threatens wider systemic continuity. The dissidents bristled, their response immediate and sharp. You invited change, they transmitted. Now you recoil because it spreads. Human representatives exchanged glances. Maribel felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when there were no good options left, only less bad ones. We need to slow it down, Captain Cauldron said. Not shut it down, modulate the interfaces, add damping layers. Damping layers reduce responsiveness, the custodians countered. They will diminish the zone's purpose. They'll buy us time, Cauldron said. Time to adapt the surrounding systems instead of forcing the zone to conform. Time was the most precious resource in the room and the most contested. The custodian's instinct was to quarantine, to sever connections before drift became cascade. The dissidents threatened withdrawal, hinting darkly that suppression would resume if the experiment was strangled. Humanity stood in the narrowing gap, painfully aware that the role of mediator came with the risk of being crushed between sides. Marable spoke, her voice steady despite the pressure. "You're looking at this like contamination," she said. "It's not, it's coupling. You built a universe where everything is interconnected, then acted surprised when change moved through those connections. The custodians did not deny this. Interconnection is necessary for large-scale stability. Then you have to accept that stability can't be static everywhere," Marable said. "Not anymore." Silence followed, not the absence of sound, but the presence of processing on a scale that dwarfed human thought. When the response came, it was not unanimous. Some custodians agreed to Calderon's proposal, others dissented, advocating immediate containment. The coalition fractured along philosophical lines that had been latent for cycles. Action was taken before consensus fully solidified. Human and aligned custodian teams began installing modulation frameworks, adaptive buffers designed to translate the zone's variability into manageable fluctuations rather than raw disruption. It was delicate work, threading flexibility into systems that had been rigid by design. Mistakes were made. One buffer failed catastrophically, triggering a localized collapse that took 3 habitats with it. Lives were lost. The deaths hit harder because they felt like proof that both sides had been right to fear this path. Grief spread, sharp and raw. The dissidents accused the custodians of half-measures. The custodians accused humanity of hubris. Humanity accused itself. Marable found herself staring at casualty reports, faces she had spoken with only days before, and wondered if survival without continuity, continuity without compassion, were both just different kinds of failure. The opportunistic coalition chose that moment to strike. They did not attack the adaptive zone directly. They attacked the fault lines around it, launching coordinated raids on peripheral systems destabilized by recent fluctuations. Their timing was precise, their intelligence frighteningly accurate. They framed their incursions not as conquest, but as intervention, broadcasting messages that painted the custodians as failed stewards and humanity as reckless agitators. Chaos followed. Human fleets scrambled, custodian defense, arrays redeployed, dissident collectives split between defending the experiment and pursuing their own agendas. The carefully balanced web of relationships stretched to its limits. Marable was aboard a mobile coordination platform when the first distress calls flooded in. She moved automatically, assigning resources, rerouting ships, her mind splitting tasks into manageable fragments the way it always had. But beneath the competence, something else stirred. A realization, slow and unwelcome. This was not just about systems or philosophies. It was about narrative. Whoever controlled the story of what was happening would shape the response of every watching civilization. The opportunists understood this. The custodians, focused on continuity, had never needed to. Humanity, born of stories as much as science, did. "We need to speak," Marable said to Calderon over a private channel. "Not just fight. We need to explain what we are doing and why." "To whom?" he asked, even as he knew the answer. "To everyone," she said, "before someone else does it for us." It was a risk layered atop risk. Broadcasting openly meant exposing vulnerabilities, admitting uncertainty, but humanity had never thrived on secrecy alone. Calderon authorized it. The transmission went out across open channels, translated and retransmitted by every allied node that would carry it. Marable did not dress it up. She spoke plainly about mistakes made, lives lost, lessons learned. She spoke of a universe that had tried to freeze itself against disaster and of those who had tried to shatter it out of frustration. She spoke of a third path, messy and dangerous, where change was allowed but not worshipped, where continuity was valued but not enforced at the cost of life. "We don't have all the answers," she said. "We are making this up as we go because the universe doesn't come with instructions. But we know this: collapse without rebuilding is death, and stability without choice is stagnation. We're trying to build something that survives and grows. You can watch, you can help, or you can oppose us, but at least know what you're opposing." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Some civilizations rejected the message outright, clinging to the comfort of custodian order or the seductive simplicity of destruction. Others hesitated, uncertain but curious. A few reached out, tentatively, asking questions, offering data, proposing cooperation. The opportunistic coalition denounced the broadcast as manipulation. Their raids intensified, but their narrative lost traction. They were predators, and predators thrived in silence, not under open scrutiny. The conflict dragged on, costly and exhausting, but slowly momentum shifted. Systems reinforced with adaptive buffers began to recover faster from attacks. Populations exposed to the broadcast proved more resistant to opportunist propaganda. The custodians, forced to act in a more transparent universe, adjusted, some reluctantly, some with growing conviction. When the dust settled, the universe had not been saved. It had been altered. The adaptive zone remained, changed by scars and compromises. Custodian space was no longer uniformly smooth, but threaded with pockets of variability. Humanity had lost people, ships, sleep, and innocence. It had also gained something harder to quantify: a voice. Marable stood once more at an observation blister, this time watching a system in mid-recovery, debris slowly coalescing into new forms under guided chaos. She felt older than she had months before and more fragile, but she also felt, for the first time since leaving Sol, that humanity was not merely reacting to the universe. It was participating in its direction. The gravity of unfamiliar mercy pressed on her still, heavier now, because she understood its cost. Mercy was not passive. It required intervention, restraint, and the willingness to be blamed when things went wrong. Humanity was learning that lesson the hard way. And the universe, no longer indifferent, was watching to see if they would keep learning or break under the weight of it. The war never received a name while it was happening, which in retrospect was the most honest thing about it. Names implied clarity, and there was none. It was not a war for territory, ideology, or survival in the narrow sense. It was a war over trajectory, over whether the universe would continue to be curated into fragile perfection or allowed to stagger forward with all the danger that implied. Most of the fighting did not look like fighting at all. It looked like emergency response stretched beyond reasonable limits, like negotiations conducted under fire, like engineers making irreversible decisions with incomplete data, because waiting would mean worse outcomes. Humanity was no longer the smallest player in the room, but it was still the youngest, and that showed in how quickly it burned through people. Rotation schedules collapsed. Psychological support lagged behind operational demand. The custodians noticed and began quietly reallocating resources, not just ships and constructs, but cognitive load. They adjusted interfaces to reduce human fatigue, altered communication cadences to align better with human perception. It was not kindness in the human sense, but it was consideration, and that distinction mattered less than it once had. Marable Quan felt the strain settle into her bones. Her promotion had insulated her from some dangers and exposed her to others. She no longer crawled through failing structures or rode emergency skiffs into debris storms. Instead, she made choices that determined whether others would. The deaths felt heavier now, not because there were more of them, but because each one traced back to a decision she had helped shape. The opportunistic coalition fractured under sustained pressure. Their strength had always been speed and surprise, not endurance. As more systems adopted adaptive buffers and open communication protocols, easy prey vanished. Some coalition elements defected, trading intelligence for protection. Others doubled down, becoming more brutal, less strategic. Those were the ones that died first. The greater threat emerged from within the custodians themselves, not the dissidents, not anymore. They had largely committed to the adaptive framework, finding in it space to argue, experiment, and fail without burning everything down. The threat came from a conservative bloc within the custodians, entities whose identity was bound so tightly to continuity that the recent changes felt existential. To them, the universe was unraveling, and humanity was the loose thread. They did not announce opposition. They prepared. Marable learned of it through anomalies that did not fit any external attack profile. Stabilizers that should have held failed simultaneously across unrelated systems. Defense arrays hesitated at critical moments, as if awaiting authorization that never came. Data streams showed evidence of deliberate constraint, systems throttled to prevent adaptive responses from fully engaging. This was not sabotage aimed at collapse. It was enforced paralysis. The conservative custodians believed that if they could demonstrate that adaptability led inevitably to uncontrollable failure, they could justify a return to absolute continuity. They were willing to let systems fall, populations suffer, as long as the lesson was clear. When the pattern emerged, it hit like a physical blow. Their engineering failure, Marable said during an emergency council session, her voice flat with disbelief. Not to win, to prove a point. The custodian liaison entity, one of the first to work closely with humans, did not deny it. The divergence within our coalition has exceeded projected tolerance. Internal resolution mechanisms are insufficient. That's a polite way of saying you're breaking apart, Captain Cauldron said. Correct. For the first time since contact, the custodians asked humanity for something more than assistance. They asked for leadership. Not command, not authority, but direction. A way through conflict that did not rely on erasure or enforced compliance. It was an extraordinary admission from beings whose civilization had been built on managing outcomes rather than negotiating values. Humanity did not accept lightly. There were fierce debates within the human fleet and back in Sol, where distance dulled urgency but sharpened fear. Some argued that this was the moment to pull back, to let ancient powers resolve their own fractures. Others warned that withdrawal now would leave a vacuum filled by the most rigid or the most destructive actors. Marable listened, exhausted, as arguments circled familiar ground. Eventually she spoke, not as an architect or envoy, but as a human being who had seen what happened when no one stepped in. We're already involved, she said. There's no clean exit anymore. If we walk away, we don't go back to being observers. We become the excuse everyone uses for what comes next. The decision was made. Humanity would help force a resolution, not by choosing a side, but by making continued stalemate impossible. The plan was risky to the point of recklessness. Human and aligned custodian teams would initiate a controlled release of variability across a cluster of key systems simultaneously. Not collapse, not full destabilization, but enough change that conservative custodians could no longer rely on paralysis without triggering outcomes far worse than adaptation. At the same time, dissident and moderate custodian factions would broadcast internal deliberations openly, exposing the cost of enforced continuity to every connected civilization. It was, at its core, a refusal to let the argument remain abstract. Marable coordinated the technical side, hands steady despite the implications. If the release went wrong, the losses would be catastrophic. If it went right, the universe would lurch into a new equilibrium whether anyone was ready or not. The moment came without ceremony. Across light years, adaptive buffers loosened in unison. Systems flexed, long-suppressed dynamics reasserting themselves. There were failures. There were evacuations. There were moments when Marable was certain she had made the worst mistake in human history. And then, slowly, something else happened. Systems did not collapse uniformly. Some stabilized into new configurations more resilient than before. Others fragmented, but in ways that allowed recovery rather than annihilation. The diversity of outcomes was undeniable. Continuity, it turned out, did not require uniformity. It required responsiveness. The conservative custodians reacted as predicted, attempting to reassert control, but their actions were visible now, their consequences impossible to hide. Civilizations under their influence pushed back, not violently, but politically, withdrawing consent, demanding participation in decisions that affected their survival. The custodians had never governed by consent. They had governed by optimization. Now, optimization was no longer enough. The internal conflict did not end in victory or defeat. It ended in reformation. The custodian coalition restructured itself, fracturing into semi-autonomous assemblies bound by shared principles rather than absolute mandates. Some chose to remain largely static, prioritizing continuity above all else. Others embraced adaptive frameworks, accepting higher risk in exchange for growth. Crucially, movement between these assemblies was permitted. No civilization would be locked into a single trajectory forever. Humanity was not placed above any of them. It was not crowned mediator-in-chief or universal problem solver. Instead, it was acknowledged as a reference species, a living example of what long-term survival through instability looked like. Flawed, exhausted, still arguing with itself, but demonstrably not erased by change. The war ended without a final battle. In its wake, the universe felt different, louder perhaps, less predictable, but also less brittle. Marable finally took leave, the first extended rest she had allowed herself in months. She spent it aboard the far horizon, which had become more home than any planet. She watched stars drift past and tried not to catalogue their risks. Captain Cauldron joined her one cycle, standing beside her at the blister in companionable silence. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked eventually. Marable did not answer immediately. She thought of Rhea, of the habitats lost, of the lives saved, and the ones that would never know they had been. She thought of a universe that no longer pretended there was only one correct way to exist. "I think we did a human thing," she said at last. "We stepped in when we probably shouldn't have, and we tried to make it better anyway." Calderon smiled faintly. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have." As the far horizon set course for its next destination, neither deep in custodian space nor fully within human influence, Marable felt something unfamiliar settle alongside her exhaustion. Not triumph, responsibility. The universe had not asked humanity to save it. Humanity had chosen to act, and the consequences would unfold over centuries. The gravity of unfamiliar mercy no longer felt like a burden imposed from outside. It felt like a weight humanity had picked up, knowing full well it could be crushed by it, and deciding to carry it anyway. History did what it always did in the aftermath of upheaval. It simplified. Within a few cycles, human networks were already compressing events into timelines and causal chains that implied far more intentionality than anyone involved had ever felt. There were position papers arguing that humanity had assumed a destined role, countered by equally confident analyses insisting everything had been accidental, an emergent property of flawed systems colliding at the wrong moment. Both missed the point in different ways. What had happened was not destiny or accident, it was accumulation. Small decisions layered until turning back was no longer possible. The universe did not stabilize into a new normal. It never had. What changed was how instability was handled. The reformed custodian assemblies diverged rapidly. Some retreated inward, refining static perfection within tightly controlled domains. Their systems became marvels of predictability, places where catastrophe was almost unknown and surprise nearly extinct. Others leaned into adaptive principles, building frameworks that assumed failure would occur and focused on recovery speed rather than prevention. These regions were louder, messier, and strangely vibrant, their cultures evolving at a pace the old custodians would once have found alarming. Movement between them became the most radical change of all. Civilizations migrated not just physically, but philosophically. Worlds that had grown weary of constraint relocated or restructured themselves to exist within adaptive zones. Others, traumatized by recent losses, sought the shelter of continuity-first assemblies. For the first time in recorded custodian history, choice became a structural variable rather than a statistical nuisance. Humanity watched this unfold with a mix of pride and unease. It was one thing to demonstrate a way of surviving chaos. It was another to see others adopt it, sometimes poorly, sometimes recklessly, and suffer as a result. Human advisors were requested everywhere and just as often refused. Humanity learned quickly that influence without authority was exhausting in a way command never was. Maribel Quan declined most invitations. She remained aboard the Far Horizon, now reassigned as a long-range liaison vessel, moving between regions where misunderstandings still sparked conflict and assumptions still killed. Her title changed again, this time to Systems Mediator, a label she privately despised. It suggested balance, neutrality, a calm she rarely felt. What she actually did was listen until patterns emerged, then suggest options no one liked equally, but everyone could live with. Age began to catch up with her in small ways. Reaction times slowed. Recovery took longer. She noticed it first during a routine inspection when she had to pause halfway up a ladder, breath coming harder than it used to. The ship's medical systems flagged nothing urgent. This was not damage, it was time. The custodians noticed too. During a scheduled exchange, the liaison entity studied her longer than necessary, its luminous patterns subdued. Your physiological indicators show decline, it observed. Your contribution window is narrowing. Maribel smiled tiredly. That's true of all of us, eventually. Eventually is a variable we attempt to minimize. Humans don't, she said. We plan around it. The custodian processed this. You plan to cease active participation? Not immediately, Maribel said, but I'm not going to pretend I'm permanent. None of us are. This remained, to the custodians, humanity's most baffling trait. Entire civilizations built on the acceptance of impermanence. Individuals who knew they would die and acted anyway, sometimes recklessly, sometimes with extraordinary care. Continuity through succession rather than persistence. It was also the reason the custodians had stopped trying to fully absorb humanity. They had learned, slowly and with discomfort, that some patterns lost their function when preserved too perfectly. The final test of that lesson came not from war, but from mercy. A static custodian assembly suffered a rare failure, one that slipped past every predictive safeguard. A star's output fluctuated beyond tolerances, threatening a chain reaction that would sterilize 3 inhabited worlds. The assembly's doctrine forbade adaptive intervention. Their protocols demanded isolation and loss containment. Billions would die, but continuity elsewhere would be preserved. The assembly requested no help. Humanity intervened anyway. The Far Horizon was one of dozens of vessels that responded, human crews working alongside adaptive-aligned custodians to jury-rig stabilization methods the static assembly considered heretical. The operation was frantic, dangerous, and only partially successful. 1 world was lost. 2 survived, scarred but alive. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The static assembly accused humanity of violating sovereign principles, of introducing instability into a controlled domain. Humanity did not deny it. Maribel spoke before the full council, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and conviction. You were going to let them die because saving them didn't fit your model, she said. We couldn't accept that, not because we're better than you, but because this is where our line is. The static assembly withdrew from joint operations entirely. They did not declare hostility. They simply closed themselves off, sealing their domains behind layers of non-interference. Humanity respected the boundary, but the separation carried a quiet grief. Not every difference could be reconciled. Not every mercy could be mutual. Time passed. The Far Horizon became a legend in small ways, a ship associated with difficult conversations and impossible compromises. Its crew changed, old hands rotating out, new ones stepping in with the same mix of fear and determination Marable once had. She trained her replacement carefully, teaching not just procedures, but judgment, the hardest thing to pass on. When she finally stepped down, there was no ceremony worthy of the stories people would later tell. She transferred command, signed off on her last report, and stood alone at the observation blister one final time. The stars looked the same, they always did, but she knew better now. She knew that behind the light were systems breathing, adjusting, failing and recovering in ways that would never be perfectly predictable again. She knew that humanity's presence had not fixed the universe and never would. It had complicated it. It had added noise, friction and choice. She found that she did not regret that. Captain Calderon, older now himself, joined her. "You could stay on," he said quietly. "Advise, observe." Marable shook her head. "It's time for someone else to carry it. The weight, the mercy," she said. They stood together until the stars shifted with the ship's slow turn. When Marable left the far horizon, she did not return to Sol. She settled in an adaptive system on the edge of custodian influence, a place still figuring itself out. She taught, consulted, and eventually faded into the background of a civilization that would never quite know how much she had shaped its possibilities. That, she thought, was as it should be. The universe continued, not smoothly, not safely, but with room to change and recover, to make mistakes without guaranteeing extinction. Continuity had not been abandoned, it had been reframed. Humanity did not become its guardian or its conscience, it became its reminder that survival was not the opposite of mercy, and mercy was not the enemy of continuity. That to live was to risk breaking, and to care enough to rebuild anyway. And the universe, vast and unfeeling in its physics, carried that lesson forward, written not in laws or mandates, but in countless imperfect systems, still standing, still changing, still alive.